It's no secret to the people who follow my YouTube channel and have for some time that I care a lot about adaptations. The longer I've spent in fandom spaces, the more this phenomenon really vexes me. It seems like we can't get film or series adaptations of games and books without there needing to be some reference to fidelity to the source material. Don't get me wrong, I think there are some ways in which this is important, but it's crucially always going to be a game of give and take. There are some adaptations that I think are really great, like Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, adapting J.R.R. Tolkien's books of the same name. And that's not a totally controversial thing to say, although when they came out, there was no big online content creator or commentary industry to the degree that there is now, where YouTubers constantly try to produce reviews of everything when things come out. I liked the films when I first saw them, of course, but I think insight can take time, and if I was going to make a video about them, I would hope it was more than just talking about how epic the fight with the Balrog is, or how strong an actor Sean Astin is. But even back when those films came out, there were people in the fandom who were really pissed about certain things. The ones that came to mind are the removal of Glorfindel for Arwen, the total removal of Tom Bombadil, the amount of material in the Shire that gets cut, a ton of the material at the Council of Elrond that gets condensed and needs to be communicated elsewhere through smaller character moments that change how viewers might interface with these characters, and of course nitpicks over portrayals of certain characters, like Gimli being used too much for comic relief, Orlando Bloom being too serious and human-looking to play Legolas, Elijah Wood being too mopey for Frodo, or Aragorn having a beard. And that's just the first film. But adapting books to film is hard enough. You are, at minimum, going to need to make some changes that affect things like how characterization is conveyed to the audience, or what the overall pacing of the story will be. With video games, a film adaptation is much more challenging. There's some basic similarities when it comes to altering what the audience will know and how they know it, or how you pace the story, but I personally don't think it's as simple as all that. The thing about every artistic medium is that it has something or some mixture of some things, which sets it apart from other artistic mediums. Video games are no exception. Now, a couple years back, I got into this game called Until Dawn. It's a PlayStation game mainly, although it got a PC release later on. When I say I got into it, I mean I got really into watching other people play it. This game, like a lot of horror games, could be perfectly fun to play, but it's really interesting to watch someone else play it. The game is profoundly psychological. There's entire sections in each episode that bookend the story beats with meetings the player has with a therapist who probes their psychology, and the choices made in those therapy sessions actually affect the gameplay. Beyond that, there's a branching series of potential directions to take the broad cast of characters that can involve many or none of the characters surviving. The player is sort of playing as themselves in the first-person therapy segments, but they control a number of different characters in the majority of the game's third-person segments. Like I said, it's interesting to watch people play this game. The decisions people make that affect their outcomes obviously mean a ton of play sessions will vary from each other wildly. But it's also a horror game, meaning the person playing will be on the edge of their seat, and Until Dawn is scary enough and has enough misdirection in it to make that possible, or at least to induce a little anxiety. The game is about a lot of things. It's about fear, about selfishness, about choice, you name it. I saw earlier this year that a movie adaptation had released, but didn't see it until recently, as a little Halloween trick-or-treat to myself when I wasn't feeling well. Lots of spoilers for this movie and the game ahead. If you want the raw experience of seeing it and getting all the twists, then watch it and come back. It's not a super long movie, and it's currently on Netflix. I'm pretty easily scared, and this film does something really well with its horror. I don't actually mind supposedly cringy teenage characters, and the neat thing about these characters is that they kind of deliver on the tone of the original cast while being something completely new. I don't actually go into adaptations because I want to see actors reenact scenes I've already played through myself. It's why my favorite episodes of The Last of Us' adaptation are the ones where the show veers into showing us some more of something the game sort of teased or didn't fully show. Even if it means changing things, I think that's okay as long as it's interesting and makes some degree of sense. The way there are these tonal shifts with character dialogue, even around character deaths in this film, kind of replicates the feeling of watching somebody fuck up at playing a video game on their stream, which I'll get to in a minute, but overall, something about it just works for me. The thing about the game, Until Dawn, is that it's got a couple bait-and-switch moments. The first is obviously that you're misdirected into thinking that a slasher had something to do with the death of the sister in the game's prologue, but it's kind of obviously not the whole story. So eventually when this more conventional horror trope gets reinforced, you start thinking maybe it's real, But then it really is a bait and switch because one of the characters is just pranking the others as revenge. Meanwhile, this is actually the gaming equivalent of a monster film, not a slasher film, and the movie monster in question is a Wendigo. The thing about this is that it kind of leans on a specific piece of indigenous folklore, but it is genuinely pretty intense and scary. The film kind of does that same misdirection where initially you're led to believe this is a slasher film with some Stephen King elements. For example, I thought it was cute how the characters enter the eye of a storm and find a welcome center, literally. But there's also a machete-wielding maniac who emerges when the lights go out. One of the characters writes her name in the Welcome Center's guestbook and realizes that other people's names repeat in the book, becoming more unintelligible every instance. The arrival at the Welcome Center, or the attempt to leave, sets off a sequence of events where an hourglass traps the group in a time loop where they're killed by various scary things, cabin-in-the-woods style. There's this IGN article by Matt Donato that points out basically the same thing, but he seemed to have a more negative view of the film. I wanted to quote from this piece because it's basically totally the opposite of everything I believe. Sony's desire to release an Until Dawn adaptation seemed misguided upon announcement, and after viewing the film, it's still a head-scratcher. That's because David F. Sandberg's Until Dawn movie betrays the core hook of Supermassive's Until Dawn. Writers Gary Doberman and Blair Butler chose to adapt Until Dawn as the title reads. In this case, Until Dawn translates into a time loop-like horror scenario where 5 young adults find themselves hunted by various baddies, and they only escape if they can survive until dawn. Should anyone die, they'll wake once a giant hourglass fixed to an ominous skull-adorned mount drops its last grain of sand. Die enough times, and you become a Wendigo lost to Dr. Alan J. Hill's delirious experiment. The core impetus of a missing sibling is still there. Ella Rubin's protagonist, Clover, is hunting for her missing sister, but otherwise you're not on Blackwood Mountain, aka Mount Washington, yet, and certainly not similarly punished for choices that alter narrative paths. That's not Until Dawn. Like I said, I agree with basically none of this. Don't get me wrong, the descriptions of the film and game on offer in this piece are basically completely accurate. It's just not an indictment of the film, because I think a very crucial element is being left unspoken. There's a bunch of other stuff that comes up in this review, like the question of whether Clover actually beats Dr. Hill or whether anything that happens is actually consequential, unlike the game, where each action is highly consequential. The thing is, I think this totally misses what this film is trying to do. The time loop, for instance, is the film's way of implementing the chapter restart mechanic, whereas the consequential nature of death is apparent in what you might call the doomed runs the characters go on, where they realize they've screwed up and have to die again to reset the clock. This isn't missing the point of the game, it's actually very clearly a film made by someone who understands the game pretty well. It's different for sure, but it's purposefully different, which is meaningful. A beat-for-beat film adaptation would just have been a monster film. It would lose the stuff that made the game unique because it's not playable. Maybe if they did something like Clue, they could release different cuts to different showings of the film, but this is a good take, I think. The gameplay mechanics are actually written into the world of the film. Even the butterfly effect mechanic with the therapist who reprises his role as the Doctor is here. He has psychological profiles of the characters and reveals that Clover's own fears are creating the monsters. That's actually a compelling implementation of the gameplay mechanic. There's an insinuation that the Doctor in this game actually survives because the clock starts again when the group of friends beat the game after killing him and escaping. At the end, you can hear him whistling as a new group arrives at the Welcome Center. This isn't because Clover failed. She won. She beat the game. Now, someone else is playing, controlling new characters. You see what I mean? I've very rarely seen films that are clearly not only about video games, but also made by people who understand video games in adaptation. This is really smart, I promise. It's actually pretty clever in that when you pay attention to how the events of the film are all instances of gameplay mechanics, not game narrative plot beats, literally the playable mechanics the player interacts with, it makes so much sense. I don't want to pick on IGN too much. They're far from the only source that fumbled this film. A quick scan of the critic reviews on Rotten Tomatoes shows a list of people who, by and large, don't really get the continuity between this film and its source material. But by contrast, a couple people did. There's a Time article by Richard Newby, great name by the way, awesome name for a guy writing an article about a video game adaptation, love that for him, that actually seems to get this, so I'd like to quote it for a point of contrast. The filmmaker's desire for creative freedom while playing around within the world of Until Dawn is an understandable one, and I'd argue that the film still feels of a piece with the game, with the characters fulfilling the archetypes you'd see in a supermassive game, and Jennifer Spence's production design nailing the vibe and look of set pieces that would feel right at home in the game. Additionally, the film takes a page from the VR spin-off game Until Dawn Rush of Blood, which sees the character caught inside the mind of one of Until Dawn's central characters and facing off against various nightmares inspired by his anxieties and fear of death. These aspects, along with the film implementing a version of the chapter restart option in the game with the time loop mechanism, all capture the spirit of the game. What Sandberg's films lean on is the quieter moments of the game that give players the option to talk to the other characters and learn more about them while building stronger relationships of both negative and positive impact. I think that's a fair take, and it's also something people seem to have totally missed when acting like Until Dawn is just a generic horror film. It really isn't. There's a strong possibility that the writers and director just understand this video game series better than you, which is a thing that will be increasingly possible as people who have played the same video games we've played get good work in Hollywood, or as video games are hopefully increasingly treated like actual works of art worth respecting and not toys for children. This isn't just some desperate, barely related IP cash-in. It's a sincere attempt to adapt something about the medium of video games to film that has barely ever been tried, and I think that matters, especially if you care about video games. Another thing the film gets right is the slasher misdirection. The first way the characters die is to the slasher, sure, and he comes back around a few more times, but crucially, there's a lot of ways to die in this film, and they're all real. So the slasher being real makes the misdirection feel more sincere when you realize it's also a monster movie with Wendigos again. Speaking of misdirections on misdirections, there's a neat little sequence where the lights are flickering, and a Wendigo is sneaking up on Clover, and we can see over her shoulder, and it kind of wanders off after being on the left side of the screen. So when the camera follows Clover after she lets out a sigh of relief, and it reveals what's on her right, the obvious play is to have the Wendigo be waiting there. But while a Wendigo is in fact there, it's not the same one, and it's actually already dead. Little stuff like that really makes this film feel more self-aware, which is probably some real DNA it shares with Cabin in the Woods, but I like this better. There's a cool angle, too, because unlike with Until Dawn, where some characters can live while the others can die, the group of characters are all consequential. Nobody gets left behind or sacrificed. They all make it. In that way, death is almost more consequential in the film, because if only one person dies, everybody resets. The dual objectives are to survive and kill the Doctor. The core principle appears to be that the Doctor requires that someone die to save the others, which of course would be an inversion of the idea that the subjects transformed into Wendigos were so afraid of dying that they even ate other humans to stay alive. In this case, the Doctor seems to want someone to sacrifice themselves, thereby overcoming that fear and also doing something selfless as opposed to something selfish. Because he's in the film though, and therefore in the Hourglass game, overcoming him becomes one more way out, provided the characters also escape from the Wendigos. Ultimately, I think this is a really creative film and just deserves to be on more people's radars. It might even be my film of the year, I just liked it that much. Maybe that's because I'm a fan, but I also like a good horror film anyway. That's it for me, everyone. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my Patreon and channel memberships for more ways to support the channel. I'll see you in the next one. Until then.